Hello to all the listeners, and thank you for joining us for 3 episodes dedicated to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth is considered the most beautiful story in the Bible and one of the most beautiful short stories ever written. On the surface, it appears to be a simple love story, resembling countless Cinderella fairy tales about a poor girl with whom a rich man falls in love, marries, and all her troubles end, and she lives happily and wealthily ever after. The truth, of course, is quite the opposite, since the Book of Ruth is a sophisticated and complex story that, like all biblical stories, fulfills the wonderful paradox of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Synergy. In other words, this story is much longer and more profound than the number of words written in it. Before diving into the story's depths, let us mention a few things about its background. According to the Bible, Ruth and Boaz were the great-grandparents of David, so we can estimate that they lived around 1100 BCE, in days when the Israelite society was still tribal. In ancient times, a tribal society was a cluster of families connected through marriage and birth ties. The families who belonged to the same tribe guarded, protected, and took care of each other in times of distress. At the head of each tribe stood the elders who belonged to the respected families of that tribe. The elders were the leaders and judges of their people, but they had no authority over people who belonged to other tribes. Another important detail is that around 1100 BCE, the entire population living in Israel lived in small agricultural villages, similar to the villages where Judah and Tamar lived, which we discussed in the previous episodes and to whose story we will return from time to time in this series. One last note that will prove to be important later is that in an agricultural society, the land was, and still is, the most important economic asset in the hands of man. But in a tribal society, the land held by the private individual was a part of the tribe's territory, and if his land was subjugated by a person who belonged to another tribe, then the territory of the man's tribe was shrunk. After this brief introduction, let us move on to the Book of Ruth. The Book of Ruth talks about a small family that belonged to the tribe of Judah who lived around 1100 BCE in a small village called Bethlehem. About 100 years from our story, a red-haired and beautiful-eyed boy named David will be born in this family and the same village. Another 1,000 years will pass, and Jesus will be born in Bethlehem, who, according to the New Testament, was the last descendant belonging to the dynasty of David. The head of the family was Elimelech. His wife was Naomi, and their 2 sons were named Mahlon and Chilion. In English, the sons' names are meaningless, but in Hebrew, the meaning of the name Mahlon is disease, and Chilion is annihilation or extermination. Most likely, these were literary names that allude to the bitter end of the brothers. In one of the years of a severe drought in the land of Israel, Elimelech went through an economic catastrophe and found himself in heavy debt that he could not repay. Since the famine was so severe, the people of Bethlehem were unable to assist him, and therefore he had no choice but to mortgage his land to a creditor who did not belong to the tribe of Judah. Elimelech's family, who lost their land and home, were uprooted from Bethlehem in Israel and settled in an ancient land that no longer exists called Moab, which was located within the territory of modern-day Jordan. Ruth the Moabite was named after the land in which she was born. For 10 years, the small family lived in Moab. During those years, Mahlon and Chilion married 2 local girls, Ruth and Orpah. But before the 2 brides conceived, a second disaster befell the family. Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion passed away, and as we have already said, the names of the sons allude to their fate. Naomi, who lost her husband and sons, asked to return to Bethlehem. But first, she had to decide the fate of her daughters-in-law, and without clarifying this point, we will not be able to proceed. Our previous series was devoted to the story of Judah and Tamar. One of the things we emphasized there was the fact that a woman whose husband passed away remained in the possession of his family. This was Tamar's situation, and now, many generations later, it was the situation of Ruth and Orpah. For this reason, when Mahlon and Chilion died, the ownership of the 2 young widows passed to Naomi. Naomi was entitled to keep them in her possession, just as Judah kept his ownership of Tamar. She was also entitled to release them and allow them to return to their father's house and remarry. Naomi chose the second option, and so she said, quote, Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back each of you to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." 1:8-9. Naomi's sad words sound like words of parting from loved ones. However, they also have legal significance. When Naomi allowed Ruth and Orpah to return to their families and remarry, she severed the legal and family connection between her and her daughters-in-law. From now on, they are free women. We would expect Ruth and Orpah to thank Naomi for her kindness and for allowing them to return to their father's home and remarry, but the two burst into bitter tears as if they were little girls whose mother was seeking to leave them behind. And if we remember that in the ancient world, girls were married at the ages of 9, 10, or 11, a painful phenomenon that we also discussed in our previous episodes and that still exists today in third world countries, it is possible that they were indeed very young girls, for whom Naomi was like a mother. Therefore, they begged her to allow them to return with her to her homeland. However, the elderly and impoverished woman firmly refused to accede to their entreaties. Naomi knew that if her daughters-in-law went with her to a foreign land where they did not belong to any tribe and had no family, then they would have no roof over their heads and no food on their plates. And here's the place to add another comment. In the ancient world, a woman's entire life was tied to her family. Initially, she was under the authority of her father, and later under the authority of her husband. For a woman who did not belong to any tribe or family, there was no framework to provide her with protection and basic means of subsistence. Naomi knew that if Ruth and Orpah went with her to Bethlehem, this was the future that awaited them, and therefore she rejected their entreaties. But when the girls refused to part from her, Naomi said the following, quote, "But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?'" Naomi's words may sound naive, but the opposite is true. Let us reread again a few sentences and explain what she said. Naomi said, "Even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them?" This sentence sends us once again to the levirate marriage law in the Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 25, which we discussed extensively in episodes 10 and 11. The levirate law was intended to provide a solution to a situation where a man passed away before he and his wife had children. Since the widow remained in the possession of her late husband's family, she could not remarry on her own accord. If she did not establish a new family and give birth to children, she would have no way to rebuild her life, and there would be no justification for her existence. To prevent this unfortunate situation, the Bible permitted one of the most severe prohibitions of incest in the book of Leviticus. Only on the condition that the widow was left without children, the brother of the deceased was obligated to marry her and bearing her a son. The firstborn son born from this marriage would be considered the firstborn son and heir of the deceased. If additional children were born to the brother-in-law and the widow, they were considered the children of their biological father. Suppose Naomi said, "Suppose I was remarried tonight and even became pregnant. Then, even if theoretically this situation had happened, it would still be required to fulfill the levirate law." Naomi's imaginary sons would be obligated to marry Ruth and Orpah and father 2 sons for them. One would be considered the firstborn son of Mahlon, and the other the firstborn son of Chilion. Naomi wanted her 2 daughters-in-law to understand what an absurd outcome their insistence on staying with her might bring. Finally, Orpah rose and went on her way to meet her fate. Naomi's level-headed words fell on Ruth's deaf ears as she refused to part from the woman who had been like a mother to her. The great love of the girl who listened only to the voice in her heart touched the heart of the author, who gave her the most beautiful words of love in the Bible. Quote, "But Ruth replied, 'Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. They firmly laced their fingers and went to Israel. They came to Bethlehem in early spring and settled there. In Israel, barley ripens at the beginning of spring, which indicates that the two women arrived in Bethlehem in early March. The wheat harvest begins after the barley harvest ends, around late June. Barley and wheat grow well in Israel because they require little water. Bread made from barley is inferior in taste and quality to wheat bread, and thus, in biblical times, was considered poor man's bread. So, the 3 or 4 harvest months of harvest are the time frame of our story. Shortly after arriving in Bethlehem, Ruth said to Naomi, "Let me go out to the field and glean among the stalks of grain behind someone in whose eyes I shall find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go, my daughter." Ruth's decision to go out and glean barley in a field she finds favorable is amazing. How dare this young brazen woman even think of entering without permission to a field of a strange man and gathering crops? In our times, we would have driven this cheeky woman away or called the police to arrest her. But Ruth's words were correct. The Book of Deuteronomy lists 4 social classes that were considered the weakest and the poorest in Israel: the widow, the orphan, the foreigner, and the Levite. Widows and orphans had no husbands or fathers to support and defend them. The foreigner did not belong to any tribe for mutual support and assistance in times of need. The status of the Levites during the biblical period was particularly problematic because they did not own their land. According to the Bible, God was aware of the plight of the poor and ensured that the tribal society would take responsibility for supporting them. One of the social laws God created is gleanings, corner, and forgotten produce. This law is written in the books of Leviticus 23, 22, and the book of Deuteronomy 24, 19-22, and 26, 12-13. The gleanings were the barley or wheat that accidentally fell from the harvester's hands. The corner was one edge of the field or orchard. From the beginning, the produce that grew in the corner was designated for the poor, and the owner was supposed to leave it untouched. The forgotten produce was what was accidentally left behind. According to the principle of that law, the harvesters walked only in a forward direction. They did not return to gather the produce that fell or was left behind. Since Naomi and Ruth were widows and Ruth was a foreigner, they belonged to the poor class. Therefore, Ruth was entitled to go after the harvesters and gather the barley that might have slipped from their hands. After Ruth and Naomi finished their conversation, Ruth went out to one of the crop fields near Bethlehem. The hand of fate led her to the field of Boaz, the wealthy farmer and the third hero of the story. The love story that developed between Ruth and Boaz against the backdrop of the wheat fields of Bethlehem teaches us a lot about the ways of tribal society and the legal practices that dictated its actions, which we will discuss in the next episode. Before we part, let us summarize in a few sentences the main points we have made in this episode. The Book of Ruth was not written in a vacuum, but against the backdrop of the social reality and the laws that existed at the time it was written. For this reason, it is crucial to comprehend the tribal structure and the laws that governed the behavior of the story's protagonists, who lived over 3,000 years ago. We will talk about the legal system that underlies the story in detail in the next 2 episodes. Before we part, we must reiterate that we need the help of our listeners to produce more episodes. The production of this podcast requires expertise in various fields in which our listeners are present in each episode. Dr. Ravid has extensive historical, legal, and societal knowledge, as well as expertise in the ancient Hebrew in which the Bible was written. Producing this podcast is particularly expensive, also due to the need for assistance from various professionals. Those willing to support this unique project are welcome to visit our website, which was designed by Omer Binder, and contribute through our Patreon page or buy us a coffee. Those interested in purchasing Dr. Ravid's book, Daily Life in Biblical Times, can do so through our podcast's website. The book examines the actions of biblical heroes considering the social and legal norms that existed in their time, which obligated them to act in the way they did. Ravid's book contains translations of numerous puns and wordplays that offer additional insights into the stories, which are lost in the English translation. Thank you for listening to us. Please recommend our podcast to friends and family, and until next time, goodbye and all the best.